So a little bit about me. Helen touched on it. I actually run the online group of Harvard Business School. Unfortunately, I have to commute from from Framingham in normal times into the Boston area. I went to HBS myself back in late 90s. That's kind of what brought me to New England. And then I stayed around after I graduated, left for a while, lived in a few places, and then came back after this position came open to come work here, and it's been wonderful so far. And I was a graduate also of the University of Notre Dame, where I studied mathematics, and I'm a former Air Force officer too. So after college, did the military life as well that I'll talk about, living as a child of a Air Force aviator. Just a quick thing on why I wrote what I wrote. My father has a book that's been in print for a while now about his time as an astronaut. It's called Riding Rockets. And it was interesting reading that. Most kids don't have the opportunity to read a kind of detailed description of their own parents' life. And it really got me thinking about my own life. And I thought, hey, it was kind of a unique and interesting childhood. I'm going to just start writing some notes down and see where it goes. And I really didn't write it with the intent to publish it. I wrote it thinking that it would be great for my own kids, just as my father's was for me, to understand a little bit better about, what shaped him and what his youth was like. And so I did it. And after I started sharing it with a few people outside of the family, many gave me kind of support to publish it. And so here we are. And in the end, while I describe it, sorry, let me get the next slide here. I describe it it's definitely a coming of age book, and it's kind of a Right Stuff meets American Pie, if anybody remembers that movie. So I will say, by the way, the book is an adult book in the sense that there's adult humor and adult situations. It's not, even though it's about a kid, it's not a kid's book. But in the end, a lot of people have described it to me this way, and I think it's fair. It's kind of a love letter to my own father, because I really was fortunate to have two great parents who let me kind of find my own path. And it can also be difficult when you're one of your parents, in my case, my father, is doing something that's so unique and so interesting, and is literally the stuff of American heroes. Often, I think kids can feel a need to live up to something like that, and I never felt that as a kid. And I owe my father a lot for that, and my mother. But the book is really about me growing up in that environment and how I desired and really longed to be a person of consequence, like my father. But it probably wasn't going to take the same path that he did. So in the beginning, I was born in California, and you see I have a twin sister here. This is my mother, who looks like she could be my daughter now. It's time really flies. I have a twin sister and a younger sister. I was born in California. This is an image of us in England. I have no idea why I'm wearing that helmet. I seem to have a lot of pictures as a child with goofy hats on. I think fortunately, maybe I lost that passion as I got older. And then here we are back in California again. And there you see my younger sister with me and my two parents. I show those few slides just to point out, and it was alluded to in my military brat life here, is that if I trace my life for a period here, I started at Mather Air Force Base in California, where I was born. Then we went to Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho, where my father did some more training. Then he went to Vietnam for a year, and my sisters, my mother and I, relocated to Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, simply because my parents were both from Albuquerque. That's where Kirtland is. So the Air Force let them move back there. Then from there, it was off to the UK and living near Oxford at RAF Lakenheath. Then back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Then to Edwards Air Force Base in California. Back to New Mexico for a short stint. Then to Eglin Air Force Base in California. That's where my father was when he was selected as an astronaut. So then we moved to Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas after that. The thing that's interesting about this chart is all of these moves occurred before I was 8 years old. So it gives you an idea of how nomadic my early life was, and it was very nomadic. I have to say, though, that I think that, and often today, I think a lot of parents worry about this for their children way much more than they should. I actually think this helped me become a much more connected person. It made it much easier for me in my life, I think, to walk into a room and meet people I'd never met before and make friends quickly. It's a skill you develop well as a military brat, I think. So I don't think it's all bad. I mean, certainly there are advantages. And I will say I had the advantage of, after he was selected as an astronaut, to spend my next 8 or 9 years in Houston. So I went to the same high school and everything. So that was probably a little easier than if you had to make moves later in life. Let me read really quickly here, just a couple paragraphs from the book, just where I'm describing what it was like with my mother, who was very regimented in the way we did these moves. I said, my mother was a homemaker who raised my sisters and me as if she was a 1930s Italian village matron, broom in hand, shooing us out of the house if we crossed the threshold with even a micron of dust on our shoes. She ruled whatever house we occupied with order, process, cleanliness, and when necessary, discipline. Every object had its place, every happening had its time, and every child had his or her tasks. It was as if Mom was trying to force order into an unmoored nomadic military life that, absent her efforts, would descend into chaos. My sisters and I sensed this, and fearing what might happen without that order, jumped at Mom's commands, knowing that we were all better off doing so. There was comfort in this, from our 2-story, very small brick apartment in England to our ranch home in Florida to our bungalow in California. A consistent sense of place permeated. The walls and floors may have changed every few years, but the same pictures hung on those walls with the same furniture sat on those floors, their positions and prominence relative to each other consistent from floor plan to floor plan. Mom's design sense was good at duping us into believing that nothing had changed. I was happy for that. I suspect that many of you had parents who were similar, or certainly, had that kind of regimentation in a life where there's a number of children and there may be reasons to where it's not as stable as it otherwise could be. Fortunately for me, the stability didn't have anything to do with my parents directly. It just had to do with the profession my father had chosen. So in my dad, I mentioned that my book is kind of a love story to my father. He really had this wanderlust and stroked my imagination and that of my sisters in ways that really had an impact on me. There was very little that he wasn't curious about. In fact, I wrote a blog post recently and said that if I could snap my fingers and make the world a better place in all ways, it would be this. It would be to imbue in everybody a sense of curiosity that my parents imbued in me. Because curiosity is kind of the root of critical thinking. And without critical thinking, we're kind of all lost, right? I think you see it in the public discourse now. It gets so easy for everybody on all sides to believe anything and not critically think about whether what they see is true or not. I really think that when I really dig deeply and think about what mattered, I think that mattered greatly in my upbringing and youth. By the way, this is my father in Vietnam. I always say this picture makes me so jealous. I think he looks like a movie star in Top Gun or something in that pose. And I had always wanted to be a pilot myself. And this is his background. He was born in the 1940s, 1945. He went to West Point, but was able to go into the Air Force, West Point being the Army's academy. But at the time, he was able to take his commission in the Air Force. And what's interesting, there was a great lesson here for me, is he wanted nothing than to be an astronaut. You see him here probably at the age of 13, 14 with a rocket he built himself. He would have loved to have been an astronaut, but at the time, astronauts were all military flyers, military pilots specifically, and test pilots more specifically. The problem was my father, once he entered the Air Force, found out his eyesight was going to disqualify him from being a pilot. So he ended up being a backseater. So think of the movie Top Gun again. Goose, the guy that sat in the backseat. That's what my dad did in fighter bombers. But he always said to us kids, when he looked back on his life after becoming an astronaut, is at that point he thought his dream to be an astronaut was dead because he wasn't a fighter pilot. But then NASA changed the rules when the shuttle program came around, and it made it possible for him to become an astronaut. That happened in 1978. This is the first group of space shuttle astronauts that my father was selected in. You can see him here. If you can see my pointer right here. The class is famous for a lot of firsts. Obviously, Sally Ride is in it, the first American woman in space. Kathy Sullivan is on here. She was the first American woman to do a spacewalk. The first African American in space is on here, Guy Bluford. So it really was a pretty impressive astronaut class. And it was really exciting for me as a kid when I already idolized my father and aviation. As you can imagine, this was a huge deal for me when he got selected. I think I might have been more excited than him. Here's a picture of him, by the way. And he points out it's very interesting. And I think of this in my life. My dad's world and kind of my world by extension were all men. As you can imagine, in the 60s, 70s, even early 80s, The military was all men. Certainly the military aviation community was all men. And by the way, it was almost all white men too. It was not a very diverse place. And my father often comments about how unusual it was for him. He had never worked with a woman in his life. He went to a Catholic school where men, high school where men and women were segregated. He went to West Point where there were no women at all. He went to flight training where there were no women. He went to Vietnam, which was obviously a very male-dominated machismo kind of environment. And now he's put in a world where he has to work with women. He even says, he developed so much during that time because he was skeptical at the beginning, like a lot of men of his age, and then ended up having the utmost respect. Here you see him sitting next to Sally Ride. This is shortly after he was selected as an astronaut. In this picture here, by the way, over here on the far right is Judy Resnick. She was on my father's first space shuttle mission with him. She ultimately died on Challenger. Same with this gentleman sitting behind her. That's Dick Scobie. He also perished on Challenger. And then Ron McNair over my dad's right shoulder also perished on Challenger. So Challenger was as you might imagine, a big hit to that community. Let me talk a little bit about what the space shuttle is. I'm sure everybody knows what it is, but I want to go into a little bit of details for the purposes of explaining something later. So the space transportation system is what makes up the whole shuttle complex, if you will. There's the 2 solid rocket boosters, a big external tank, and the space shuttle, which is called the orbiter in other venues. And this is the way it worked. You launch with the shuttle attached to this external tank. The shuttle has 3 engines on it that feed fuel out of that tank. The 2 solid rocket boosters on either side provide thrust. The thing about solid rocket boosters that's dangerous, I mean, we all know they were the reason for the Challenger disaster, but beyond what caused that, solid rocket boosters are like a firecracker. Once you light them, you can't control them. They're going to burn, and you're going somewhere whether you want to or not. That's not the same for the liquid engines on the back of the space shuttle, which can be turned on, turned off, and throttled. And that's important for another part of our discussion later. So after about 2 minutes in flight, the solid rockets separate. Then at about 8 minutes in flight, the external tank separates because the shuttle doesn't need to burn fuel anymore because it's in orbit. It hangs out in orbit for a few days or goes to the International Space Station later in the program, and then it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere and lands like an airplane. Launch, as a kid, I was always terrified of launch, and I was terrified of the shuttle program. A lot of people always ask me, were you scared after Challenger? And the answer is no, I was scared before Challenger because I had grown up in a world where my father and his friends were flying aircraft, and many of those friends were killed flying airplanes. And even at 8 or 9, 10 years old, I knew the shuttle was much, much more complex than an airplane. So the logic held that if an airplane could kill you, why couldn't the shuttle? Certainly Challenger brought it home and Columbia later. But when you think of what a launch is, you're taking something that weighs on the order of 4.5 to 5 million pounds. You're accelerating it to 17,500 miles an hour and 250 miles in altitude in 8 minutes. I mean, if you just pause and think about that, that is a staggering release of energy, and harnessing it is dangerous. We will lose people again. Obviously, we lose people on airliners. There's no reason we won't lose people in space travel. But it was a very, very interesting system. The one other thing I'll point out that a lot of astronauts kind of quietly talked about that really bothered them is there was absolutely no escape system. All of these people for their whole careers strapped into airplanes and did crazy things, but they always had an ejection seat to save them if something went wrong. That was not true in the space shuttle. You were trapped, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. By the way, when my father was selected, for me as a kid, this was really cool. And I was always a bit of an artist as a kid, loved to draw. And the crew asked me to help them design a patch for their first mission. And, for me, this was like being asked, in fact, I think I equate it in my book to, being a kid and being asked to be the bat boy for the Boston Red Sox when you grew up in Boston. I mean, this was just awesome. And what's really cool is you actually see a photo here of the picture I actually drew after many iterations. And on the right is the official NASA patch. So the kind of lineage of what was drawn as a kid did end up in the real patch. And that was really a thrill for me. Still is to this day, to be honest. But again, it gives you a sense of how much I idolized my father and his profession. Felt like I was a part of it. So his time comes for his first launch in 1984. It's on the very first flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery. This is the 12th Space Shuttle mission. To put that in context, I'm trying to remember, I think the total number of shuttle missions is on the order of about 135. So this is very early in the program. And this is also halfway to Challenger. So Challenger occurred on the 25th mission. Again, this is the 12th mission. And this is where you start to realize the danger of this. So what you see on the left here, what looks like a launch, it's actually not. The first time they attempted to launch, if you recall, I mentioned those 3 liquid engines on the back of the space shuttle. Because those are controllable and the solid rocket boosters aren't, you actually light the liquid engines on the shuttle about 6 seconds before you fire the solid rocket boosters, because you have time to see if they're working okay and then shut them down if they're not. And certainly if they're not, you also keep the solid rockets from igniting. So on the day of this launch, and my book actually starts with this, it was terrifying for me. It was very, very foggy. We're 3 miles away in a secluded area with some other astronauts who are our family escorts watching this. It was hard to see the launch pad. We saw a flash that looked like the engines igniting, and then we heard there was a shutdown, and mission control and launch control were clearly confused. And that was unnerving, because NASA, if they're known for anything, is that calm, cool, collected in the face of adversity kind of personality, if you will. And that didn't exist. And then, so what happened was the system worked just as it should. The engines, they detected a problem with the liquid engines. They shut them down before the solid rockets ignited. But then a fire erupted at the bottom of the launch pad, licking the side of the space shuttle. And that was terrifying, because we can hear them talking about this. And launch control assured the crew that it was a small fire. And as my dad said, when you're sitting on 4 million pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, there's no small fires. So it was really a very scary moment, and was the first time I realized, shoot, this could kill my father. Even though I said I knew the dangers, it really was driven home pretty clearly at this point. So finally, after that launch abort, there was a delay of about 3 months, and they end up launching in August. This is actually a photo of the launch, which I think is really spectacular. You can see the sun rising over the Atlantic Ocean to the east as the shuttle lifts into orbit. And here he is in orbit. And as I say, it was a dream realized for him, but it was also a dream realized for me. I was over the moon and ecstatic about him being able to do this. I felt like I was a partner with him in this adventure. Meanwhile, I was in high school. And as you can tell from this photo, I was probably not Mr. Popularity. If I sound like I was a bit of a nerd, I certainly looked the part as well. And I was, as I mentioned earlier, I really longed to make my mark in life, and was eager to do so. Like, I didn't want to wait until I was my father's age, and I didn't know how I was going to do that. And that eagerness was shaped by something else. If you think back to the pop culture of the 80s and the kind of geopolitical situation, my icons were Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Indiana Jones. And I saw them as kind of debonair, what they were portrayed as, right? These debonair ne'er-do-wells who save the world. And I loved this part of American pop culture. I must have seen these movies 50 times each. And Darth Vader and all he represented really fit with the Soviet Union of the day, right? So in the early to mid 80s, when you turn on the evening news, something I love to do and watch with my father, it was almost always about what was happening in the world and the struggle between good and evil, as portrayed as the United States versus the Soviet Union. And then you had all of this kind of movie fodder that was kind of feeding that for me. And I wanted to be a part of it in a way that made me be a hero in my own world, even if I couldn't be one like a Luke Skywalker in his. So with that in mind, I want to read one more time a passage here, a little bit longer, but this is kind of touching on this longing to be somebody. And it's to set the context here. This is the night before my dad's first launch attempt. We had gone out to the launch pad and viewed the space shuttle up close while it's bathed in light at night. It's really a spectacular scene, really, really cool. And we're driving back to the condominiums the night before launch. And my father is in quarantine at Kennedy Space Center. Even in the pre-COVID days, astronauts would go into quarantine 1 to 2 weeks before launch to make sure they didn't contract a cold or something from their family that would cause a delay, which costs a lot of money. So on the drive back to the condominium in the van, I could see the realization of what was coming start to take root in our souls. The invasive cloud held at bay by the distractions of moments before was now drifting freely into our minds. I thought of Dad, who was likely in his bedroom at the KSC, that's Kennedy Space Center, crew quarters, attempting to get some sleep. Undoubtedly, his mind was trying to find a path to reconcile the excitement born of a lifelong dream about to come true with the realization that that dream could kill him. And by the way, my father points out that despite the whole machismo fighter pilot look he might have had there, he was terrified every launch, he said. You just felt trapped and you're a prisoner and you just had to hope things worked out okay. And he believes that 85, 90% of astronauts would have said the same thing if they were put in on a lie detector. My emotions mirrored his. I had lived on the periphery of that dream in my 16 years, finding ways to connect to his experiences in small but meaningful ways. Certainly, some of that desire to connect was an almost instinctual urge written into the DNA of boys throughout the ages who want to engage with their fathers on an intimate emotional level. But for me, it was more than that. My father had been somebody, and I wanted to be somebody too. He was changing the arc of history by being a part of history. And he was doing it as the pop culture heroes of my world, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Indiana Jones, were teaching me the values of greater good above self, of bravery in the face of danger, of steady chivalry no matter the circumstances. Evenings spent watching the news with Dad convinced me that these traits would be valued above all others. Good and evil were blessedly simple to identify through the lens he had given me. The Soviets were evil, the United States good. My Catholic upbringing added a further layer of clarity about the virtues of sacrifice in a world where there was no room for ambiguity. Right was right, wrong was wrong. The self was secondary to the community. Yes, I longed like any boy to have a relationship with my father, and thankfully we had one, a rich one. But more than anything, I wanted to be somebody who mattered. As I thought of the dangers to come, I couldn't help but remind myself that dying prematurely is always a sad and heartrending thing. But dying a nobody, having not striven to leave your mark on the world, that was so much sadder. I vowed that I, like Dad, would not die a nobody. So again, the blessing and curse of having a father doing something like that maybe comes through there, but in the end, it was a net positive, I think, for me. And so what did I do to leave my mark? I became a high school cheerleader in South Texas when a male cheerleader in a high school was, something that was so out of the ordinary. I became a novelty in the community. And it may seem a weird thing to say, and I explain in the book how I ended up here, but it really was born of this desire to be somebody of consequence. I should mention that if you want to talk about bullying that you hear about today, when I hear stories of bullying, which is always a terrible thing, man, I tell you what, I took it in brutal amounts. And to my parents' credit, it kind of was water off my back. But I was shocked looking back on it at how complicit too a lot of adults were in it, because there were a lot of people who felt this was an affront that a guy would be a cheerleader. So it was me and 9 girls in my high school doing this. The reason I put this in here, though, is it really did lead to everything else that followed for me, because I went to a very large high school. There was about 850 people in my class, not in my school, but in my class. So it's the size of a small college. And so it was easy to get lost and not stand out. Doing this made me very well known, as you might imagine, and it led me to be elected class president, which then led to many other things, including getting an ROTC scholarship, which let me go to Notre Dame, which then, you could say cascaded to anything that followed after that. So it really was an important time in my life. And it really did thicken my skin, because I said I took a lot of abuse. It was particularly common for me to hear taunting having to do with being gay, which I wasn't. But when I say that it was tolerated, there would be school administrators standing next to kids who would be, calling me homo in a derogatory way, and nobody would do anything about it. And again, in South Texas in the 80s, that's probably not too surprising, because you played football if you were a boy in Texas. But it did really, really give me the sense that what other people thought really didn't matter. And again, I give my parents a lot of credit. It really helped me. And if there's anything I wish I could give my own kids, and any kid for that matter, it would be this, right? To be able to have whatever it is my parents gave me, it allowed me to brush it off. I don't want to make it sound too like I was some superhuman. It certainly bothered me at times. And I don't, like I say, give credit to my own intestinal fortitude. There was something that my parents did, partly supporting me and even doing this, that allowed me to endure that. And I know it sounds weird to equate this to being an astronaut, but I really did feel like this was something that was doing what I described in that reading, allowing me to make a mark in my own way. So let me talk about this. I'm sure all of you know this iconic image of the loss of Challenger. I have a chapter called Cold Day, where I talk about what this day was like for me. Let me mention something, particularly for people in Massachusetts. You know, I'm live not too far away from Framingham State, where Christa McAuliffe went. And when you think of when the accident happened, although it wasn't really an accident, it was predictable. When it happened, the attention around the fact that Christa McAuliffe was in it and the impact on her school, which deservedly so. I mean, it was a unique thing. Her school was obviously impacted by it. My high school that day had 3 children lose a parent, though. It was catastrophic at my school. And not only that, it's a company town. Houston is near where the Johnson Space Center is. So it's estimated that close to half the people whose kids went to the school I went to worked at the Johnson Space Center. So you not only had the loss of life of people who were 1 degree separated from you, you also had a community that felt the pain of this. And I say it's very much like, I don't know, I think it was in Worcester many, many years ago when 7 firefighters were killed, and how traumatic that was for the community. So this was very much like that, but with one distinct difference is nobody in Worcester blamed themselves for the fire that killed the firefighters. That was not the case here. The minute this happened, everybody who worked at NASA knew that they were responsible. Because none of the astronauts are flying the shuttle, right? It's all software and hardware making it happen by itself. So it was really a traumatic experience in many ways in my high school. And it was particularly scary for me for reasons which I won't go into here, but I was not watching, my high school was not watching this when it happened. You know, we were a NASA community where 25 launches already happened already. Why was this one any special than the others, even if Christa McAuliffe was on it? And so I was sitting in class, not knowing what had happened. And I had a girl in my class came to the classroom and whispered in the teacher's ear. And she asked me to go to the principal's office. And I could tell this young lady who came to get me, you know, we were 16, 17 at the time. She lived down the street from me. Her name was Angela, and she'd been crying. And I asked her what was wrong, and she wouldn't tell me. Well, my father was training for his next space shuttle mission. And when they trained, they would fly on business trips in their own little T-38 jet trainers. Looks like a little, basically like a little fighter jet. So I was convinced my father had actually been killed while flying on this business trip, and was so convinced of it. Walking up to the office, I was steeling myself for that news. That was not what had happened, obviously. The principal pulled out other astronaut kids to let him know what had happened. But it was a really weird mix of emotions. I was hugely relieved to know my father had survived or was alive, but devastated by the news these people, many of whom I hung out with as a kid, had been killed. It was a really, really tough day. I want to talk a bit about what caused it, because many people hear O-ring, and I think they have visions like I did initially of like a little O-ring you might have on a faucet in your living room that caused this accident. But that's not what we're talking about here. Let me go one slide further actually and come back. Well, actually, no, let me not do that. Let me start here. The solid rocket segments or solid rocket boosters are built in segments. And part of that's because from a manufacturing process standpoint at the time, it would be very difficult to make them in one piece. And even if you could, they were manufactured in Utah. So they had to be able to get on a train and make it all the way to Florida to be assembled. So you had to make them in segments. The problem with that is when you build something in segments like that, you have a natural weakness where you bolt the segments together. And what it looks like when you're bolting them together is this. You see the body of the solid rocket here you actually see the bolt holes used to bolt the 2 segments together. And if I go back here, what happens is you have what's called a tongue and clevis arrangement. You have a top piece of metal that slides into a groove, and then you bolt them together. Now, the problem you're trying to solve for with O-rings, let me talk a little bit about the solid rocket fuel inside of these. There's fuel inside of these, and in the center, there's a hollow core. So it's almost like a pencil with I'll say lead, but the graphite removed, right? And the way it burns is you actually light the rocket with another small rocket at the very top that shoots a flame down that middle empty core. And it burns from the inside out. It doesn't burn bottom to top. So you're burning from the inside out. The problem with that is you burn from the inside out, that fire is getting closer and closer to the edges of the booster, right? It's getting closer and closer to this white skin you see here. So you want to make sure that flame never touches that skin, because if it does, bad things are going to happen. So to help keep that flame from escaping, there were O-rings. You see them here, these black things. This is a cross section of the booster that are, I believe, they're about 14 feet in diameter, that are laying in a ring where the segments connect here. The O-ring would be around here. If you all can see my cursor, the O-ring would be around here to seal it off. That on the day of Challenger, that didn't happen. Cold weather, to a great extent, caused them to become more brittle. They didn't seal. It allowed, again, going back to here, it allowed flame to escape through one of these joints. And eventually what it did was it caused, Challenger actually was not an explosion. The booster separated from the external tank at the bottom edge of the external tank and came free, and the top of it rolled into the external tank where all that fuel is, ruptured it. All the fuel kind of sprayed out, and what you see then is that fuel being ignited by the flame of the engines around it. So, and by the way, even though my father will say this, even though it happened on a cold day, and a lot of people talk about the cold weather, it was a design flaw that was likely, regardless of temperature, to eventually have killed people.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
I don't know why my watch is talking to me. So it was a real tragedy, because of a design flaw. And as many of you know, and if you haven't seen it, by the way, the Netflix documentary on Challenger is fantastic if you want to understand more about the decisions that led to launch. And it's really a sad and sometimes very frustrating and angering story. So, and the real tragedy too of it is that if you recall me saying it wasn't an explosion, it was really just the vehicle being pulled apart. Big sections of the vehicle survived intact after it was pulled apart. Here you can see the left wing of the shuttle. Here you can see the main engines of the orbiter. And here is actually the crew cabin. And it's generally accepted today, there's a lot of evidence the crew actually survived this and didn't die until that thing hit the water about 3.5 minutes later, because I think it's about 3.5 minutes later. Because keep in mind, your altitude, you still kept going up for a long time, and then it fell back to the ocean. And so that was, that made it all the more tragic and hard for people in Houston to deal with, given that, knowing that's what happened. Because initially everybody thought, oh, well, everybody died instantly. And it was very sad. And as I said, for me, it was really sad too, because Judy Resnick, who was one of my father's better friends and flew with him on his first mission, was killed on this mission. And so as a kid, it was very traumatic. And particularly with her, because I still lived in this world where, my experience had been all male aviators. And for some reason, and it's sexist, I know, I'll admit it, but certainly the way things were back then, it seemed worse that Judy Resnick had died on this. And it really impacted me as a kid. I see that for what it was, like I said now, but that's the truth of how it felt at the time. And then I'll finish up with, right on time here, I think, at least to get some any questions you may have. Let me mention something. Oh, this is a mistake. I say Atlantis. His first flight was on Discovery, so this is his first mission. I bring this up to talk about the danger again. So we had that pad abort, which I told you all about. Once they got into orbit, they had this problem, and this is kind of interesting. A lot of people may not know this, but the space toilet, when it collects urine and other wastewater, it's actually ejected out of the shuttle into space. And when it does that, it freezes into these ice crystals, if it's working properly, which my dad and other astronauts say is spectacular, because in the sunlight, it just looks like fireworks going off. As he also says, they do not eject solid waste, which many people will be happy to hear. You don't have to worry about that falling on your head from space. But for that system to work, that nozzle has to be heated, and the heater failed on that mission, and it caused an ice cube to build on the side of the shuttle. And they were really concerned about it, and this kind of portended what sort of happened on Columbia. They were worried about it breaking off during reentry and hitting one of the control surfaces of the shuttle and causing it to either burn up or lose control at lower altitude. So they needed to knock it off. I was really bummed, because they were actually preparing, my father and another astronaut prepared for an emergency spacewalk, which I thought would have been really cool to go out and just knock it off with their hands. But they were able to use a robotic arm on the shuttle to reach over and knock it off. So they were able to get rid of that risk. And then it turns out on their mission, when I mentioned that O-ring problem, I forgot to note the solid rocket boosters parachute into the ocean and are towed back for reuse. So you see them afterwards. So NASA had already started to see evidence of O-ring burn through. And some of the certainly the most significant up until the 12th mission, And some of the most significant before Challenger occurred on my father's first mission. They had almost complete burn through of the first O-ring. And so, he might have met the same fate as the Challenger crew if those boosters had burned for another, 30 seconds. So he dodged a bullet there. And then on his second mission, dodged another big bullet, which ultimately destroyed Columbia and killed its crew. They had during launch a piece of the solid rocket nose cone break off and hit the nose and underside of the shuttle. And it ended up destroying or tearing off 700 of the heat shield tiles on the shuttle. This story is fascinating if you can find it on the internet, because this was a secret military mission. 2 of my father's missions were, he flew 3 times total, where they launched a classified payload. Their video was downleaked, was encrypted, which made the quality worse. So while Mission Control thought they saw something in the launch footage that indicated an object might have struck the shuttle and they were concerned about it, they asked my dad to operate the robot arm to look underneath the shuttle and see if they saw anything. And when my dad and the crew saw the images on their TV screen from a camera on the end of the robot arm, it was very clear. He said that the color went from his face. He's like, we're dead, because he could see these white scars along the belly of the orbiter where tiles had been damaged or ripped off, and knew it was extensive. And the crew was convinced this would kill them. And they had no options, by the way. There was no space station to go to. There was no rescue that could have come and gotten them. I mean, they were doomed if that indeed was true. When they sent the pictures down to Mission Control, they were shocked when Mission Control replied that everything looked fine to them. And they couldn't understand why. Well, it turned out that Mission Control was not seeing the same image that they were, and because it was encrypted and it was grainier, so they couldn't see the extent of the damage. It's very funny, though, the commander, who's a guy named Hoot Gibson, who was a real fighter pilot, a fighter pilot's fighter pilot, and really fits the Hollywood stereotype of it. After they found this all out and they all kind of hemmed and hawed about it, he was doing some task in the cabin, kind of whistling like he was the happiest guy in the world. And somebody asked him, hey, Hoot, aren't you worried about what might happen when we re-enter? And he said, look, nothing we can do about it. No reason to die all tensed up. I think that might be the quote of the year. Might be a mantra for 2020. And then his last mission was another military mission on Atlantis. This was the second mission after the Challenger disaster, another classified military mission. And for me, it was really cool because it was a launch at night, which I had not seen before, which I wish every human being could see. Any space vehicle launch is pretty impressive. If you ever get to see one, I would highly recommend it. And all the while, as I say, I was trying to find my way in life. And I end my book with the end of my high school time, because my father, Challenger happened my last year in high school. So when I was a senior in high school, I was preparing to go to college. And it ends with me leaving to go to college. These last 2 missions actually happened after I had gone to college. So I was a little older when they occurred. But all in all, it was an amazing experience. And I was fortunate to have 2 just wonderful parents that made me curious about a lot and gave me kind of the gumption to do things I otherwise wouldn't have. So with that, I'll stop. And you can order the book if you're interested in reading it on Amazon, either a hardcover, a paperback, or an electronic version, a Kindle version. I also am happy to ship you a book, priority mail, if you're interested. It's usually $40 because I sometimes have to ship them all over the world, but I have a coupon code that is just library in capital letters. So if you go to my website, pjmullane.com, and you order one and it asks you to tell me how you'd like it dedicated, I'll sign it for you. I'll stick that in the mail to you with the $15 discount. It's $25. So maybe somebody, a space enthusiast on your Christmas list or something. But if you don't buy a book, it doesn't matter to me. I'm just happy to tell my story and share it. So let me stop sharing here so I can see all of you. And you see my email address there too. Feel free to shoot me any questions or comments if you'd like as well.